Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Kai, and in today's video we're going to be looking at my top 5 tips for beginner photographers based on the top 5 questions that I often get on my YouTube channel. Let's go. So this video is a mini class that I made specifically for Skillshare, and unfortunately Skillshare changed their rules at the beginning of this year, and so they closed this class down because it no longer met their requirements. So I thought, instead of it being all sad and closed on the Skillshare platform, why don't I just release it to my YouTube subscribers? And that's what I'm doing now. So I really hope you enjoy these tips and tricks, particularly if you are a beginner. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and also let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Okay, let's get into it. So the first question I get asked the most is, how can I get that blurry background in my photos? And there are a couple of ways that you can achieve this, and mainly this is controlled by something called the aperture, and your max aperture will depend on the lens that you are using. And what you need to remember is that the smaller the number is on your lens, the bigger the aperture you can have, and the blurrier your background can be. So for example, I've got a very popular lens here, the Canon 50mm 1.4, and that small number 1.4 means that I can have a lot of light enter the lens and therefore have a blurrier background. And I can put this lens on my camera here, I'll turn it on, set the camera to manual, set the aperture to 1.4, and I can do this by tapping on the screen and swiping here, or holding this button here and turning the scroll wheel at the top at the same time. And that way I can set it to f-stop 1.4. This means the lens will let in the most amount of light that it can. Now I will set the ISO to 100 because I don't want my sensor to be too sensitive in this light setting. And I can do this by selecting the screen and swiping, or pressing this button here and turning the scroll wheel. Then I will set the shutter speed to compensate for the light. And I can do this by just moving the scroll wheel here by itself, or by swiping on the touchscreen. And what I want to do is check the exposure by hitting this button here, and that has a star on it. And now I can change my shutter speed till the reading for the exposure is in the middle. And that's what I want right there. And now I can shoot away to get that blurry background effect. Now my camera also has an aperture priority mode that's represented by AV, where I can quickly choose that aperture of 1.4 and it will set the other parameters for me so I can shoot away and get blurry background pictures. The second most common thing I get asked is, how can I freeze movement? For example, if action is happening, say someone's jumping up and down, how can I take a picture that will freeze them in the air? Or maybe if there's a splash of water, how can I freeze those water particles? Now you can create these types of pictures by changing your shutter speed, and we need a fast shutter speed to create that freeze in the movement. So again, I can turn my camera to manual, and I will set my ISO to about 160. I will set my aperture to f-stop 2.8, and now I will change my shutter speed here to about 1/1000th of a second, and this will enable me to shoot pictures and freeze the movement. Now this camera also has a priority shutter mode that's represented by TV on the top dial, and this will enable me to shoot the shutter speed that I want, and then the camera will choose the other parameters for me. Next up is long exposure photography, where people often create cool effects using lights. And to take these types of images, I once again need to adjust my shutter speed. But this time I don't want a fast shutter speed, I actually want a slower shutter speed where I can let the light land on the sensor of the camera for a longer period of time. So instead of having the shutter open for fractions of a second, we can leave it open for actual seconds. Now before you attempt these types of pictures, make sure that your camera is on a tripod or a solid surface, otherwise everything will be blurry. So now, change your shutter speed to something like 6 seconds. You might also need to ensure that your lens is set to manual mode, as it might struggle to find focus in autofocus mode. Then adjust your ISO down to 100, open your aperture up. I've got it set to max on these photos at f-stop 2.8 for this lens. Press the shutter button and then do the movement with your light during that time limit. and then the picture you capture will have that pattern of light. And it's a cool idea to just play around with different light sources like sparklers, LED panels, or even shooting moving cars on the highway. The fourth thing that I get asked a lot is, how do you take pictures continuously? So one after the other in a burst mode. And on the Canon cameras, this is actually quite easy to set up. You just have to go into the menu and select drive mode and then high speed continuous. And now you'll be able to shoot a barrage of photos. And the number of photos you can take depends on the camera you have. Some can shoot more photos per second than others. So I'm basically just setting up the camera to do some continuous shooting. And also check your focus settings for these types of burst shots, as they might not all be in focus. Also, if you are shooting RAW, the number of continuous photos will be reduced as the file size of those photos are much bigger. And if you don't know what shooting RAW means, don't worry, that is the last point that we will be talking about. The final tip for you beginner photographers is to shoot your photos in RAW. A RAW image is just that, an image that contains the raw data captured by the camera's sensor. So RAW files are uncompressed. They take up more space than typical JPEG images, which are compressed images, but having that RAW file gives you so much more creative freedom in your post-production work. So how do we set up our Canon camera to shoot in RAW? Well, we can simply do this by hitting the menu, going to the very first camera option, and the very first option again called image quality, and then move across to the RAW or C-RAW option. Now C-RAW is a newer compressed version of RAW. I know I just said that RAW is uncompressed, but the newer C-RAW file types allow you to save more space on your SD card while retaining a lot more information than a JPEG image. You can also save a JPEG image at the same time by selecting one of these JPEG options. So once you've done that, go away and shoot some RAW photos, and with those RAW files captured, let's very quickly jump into Photoshop to see how we can start to edit our RAW photos. So these photos are from a recent photo shoot that I did, and this is an example of one of the JPEGs. I also shot RAW, and you can see this is the JPEG image here, and next to it is the RAW image, which is over here. So if we open that up, it will open it up in Photoshop. And in Photoshop now, we can quickly start to adjust the parameters and really bring some life into this shot. So what I like to do in Photoshop is decrease the highlights, and that will help to bring back detail from the blown out parts in the sky where these shadows are. And we can lift those shadows a little bit, lift the whites a tiny bit, and then drop the blacks, crush those blacks a little bit. Then add a little bit of texture, a little bit of clarity, a little bit of vibrance as well. And then to help add a little bit of contrast in, we can make this a slight S-curve and then lift up the blacks there, so it softens those blacks. And then as we come down, what we can do in the colors is really bring back some of those blues. And as you can see, if I pull the blues in, it really makes the sky and the glass punch. And I'll bring the aquas down, the greens a little bit. We don't really want to touch the yellows or the oranges, as that will affect the skin tones. And what we can do is now open that image up, and really we can start to see, by just having that RAW file available, how much more detail we can pull out of the image and really make our image pop. So I hope you found today's video useful. If there's anything else about videography, photography, animation, or filmmaking that you want to know, let me know in the comments section below. And now that you've watched this video, make sure you go and check out this video here, which talks about all the different types of camera you can buy in 2023, or watch this video over here that YouTube thinks that you should watch. So that's it from me today, guys. Thanks again for watching. In the meantime, stay creative, stay safe, imagine, implement, and inspire, and I'll see you next time on KaiCreative.